It's very nice to be back here. I think this is the second time I've spoken in this room, and I recognise some of you from the first time. And I don't think anyone fell asleep then. I'm over here with my wife and children. We're skiing up in Gloucester, and as you can see, they're both very, very excited to be here and listening. They've already said they want to ask the first question, by the way, Anna.
Okay, that's okay.
So it's no problem. It's no problem. It's a great honour to be back here speaking, and I'm very grateful that you all turned up and listened this evening, and hopefully we'll stay awake. What I want to do is talk about some of the events that precede what went on here. We celebrate the people who undertook the sabotage operations for all of their bravery, all of their heroism, and all of the sort of great physical attributes of what they managed to achieve. What I want to talk about is what went on before that. Why did British intelligence, working with these very brave Norwegians, think that it was necessary to attack the plant underneath our feet? And there are some other Norwegians whose names I think you'll probably be familiar with. Some of them have photographs up in the other building, who were equally as brave, equally as valuable, heroic in what they achieved. Not in the same physical sense, but in providing information to British intelligence about what was going on. And these were individuals living under occupied Germany, of course, and the risk was for them that if they were discovered, they would have been executed. So I think the heroism there is just the same, and we perhaps don't recognise them because the heroics weren't in the same way as the Telemark people. So what I want to talk about, Anna has told me I've only got 20 minutes, which is a little bit tough because it's a 45-minute, 30 maybe? We'll see how far it goes. Okay, no problem. So we'll see. I'll keep going until the first person falls asleep. So what I want to talk about is these four things, not in all in the same way, but just to give you a sense of what went on that led up to the events here. And I'm not going to talk about the events here. The events here are the end point of the talk. What I want to do is talk about what went on before that. And so the first thing really is thinking about how did the atomic bomb come about? How was it that the Second World War, as many people have said, was the physicists' war? Some people argue that the First World War was all about the chemists, and World War II was all about the scientists and how they changed warfare with rockets and nuclear devices and other forms of warfare. And the atomic bomb is absolutely part of that picture. In a sense, if we go back to the origins, and the point over the next few slides is really to give you the sense that the period before this was an international effort, that the scientists working on this, the sort of leading atomic physicists of the 1910s, the 1920s, 1930s, all knew one another. And so when war broke out and national walls came down between those different countries, for them it did change things, but it also didn't change things because they were there in this international scientific community. So the origins really go back to the man on the left there, a Dane. I'm not sure, can we put pictures of Danes up in Norway? Is that allowed? That's okay, just not Swedes. Okay. And this was a physicist called Niels Bohr, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, working in England at the time in a laboratory in Cambridge, won the Nobel Prize for what he was doing, came up with this picture, which I won't try and explain to you, which, as you can see, I have stolen shamelessly from an online encyclopedia. But the key point to note at the beginning is this not very good photograph. And this is two individuals, Niels Bohr on the right, the older man, and the one in the white shirt and black tie, a German physicist called Werner Heisenberg, his then assistant. And many of these names we'll come back to as we go through this. So in the 1920s, after Niels Bohr discovered the atom, for which he won the Nobel Prize, he and Heisenberg carried on working on the science around this. Fast forward a few years into the 1930s, Bohr continued working on these things, and all of a sudden in different parts of Europe, different scientists began to explore what does the atom mean? How can we explore it in a purely scientific way? And at this time in the early 1930s, it was very much about science. So Niels Bohr was working in Copenhagen, in England in the laboratory in Cambridge. Another scientist called James Chadwick discovered the neutron, and that began to change people's understandings again. In Rome, another very famous scientist who would go on to be part of the war program in the United States called Enrico Fermi. He discovered in his fish pond that if you bombard metal with neutrons, radioactivity could be increased. But at this point, people were still not thinking about this in anything other than a scientific exercise. This was all about advancing science. Heisenberg, who is now back in Germany by the mid-1930s, was working on something called quantum mechanics. Could you split the neutron? And the scientific investigations at that time suggested that if you could split the neutron, the energy that would be released from that would be fantastic. It would be enormous. In France, a husband and wife team were looking at this, while in London, other investigations were going on. So in the 1930s, the cutting edge of science was atomic science. And people were making discoveries, and they were working in a very much of an international scientific community. And you can see that these are very bad photographs. Don't pay very much attention to them. The key point are the names in yellow. So you can see a 1927 conference on this side, a 1933 conference on this side. This one attended by Werner Heisenberg, who would go on to be the head of the German atomic program, Peter Debye, who would get involved in the German side, Arthur Compton, who would go on to be involved in the American side, Einstein, of course, who needs no introduction. Another conference here had similar people, including one Peter Kapitsa, who would end up being involved with the Russian program. So the point in all of this really is to highlight the fact that in the 1920s and the 1930s, these were scientific investigations. The international community crossed national boundaries, and people worked on this from a whole host of different countries. The other thing that began to change, certainly by the mid-1930s, moving into the late 1930s, was that many of the leading physicists were Jewish and becoming more and more concerned about what the Nazi Party was up to on the continent and its very, very strong anti-Semitic messages. Many of them began to move to other countries. So a number of important Hungarian scientists moved to the United States and would eventually become very important players in their atomic bomb program. A number of Austrians, Germans, and Italians, and various others did as well. Fast forward a few more years. The big discovery at the end of all of this, in a sense, the last big discovery at the end of this period, was in December 1938. So less than a year before Hitler invaded Poland and World War II broke out. And it was at this time that two scientists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, discovered that if you bombarded uranium with neutron, you could create a fission product, fission being the process of exploding outwards. And they shared their results, most importantly, with just one person, this lady here, a Jewish scientist who had escaped to Sweden a few months earlier. She, by total chance, was staying with her nephew, and they discussed what the findings meant, the two people here. Working on a scrap of paper, they worked out that the implications of this discovery meant that if you split just 1 gram of uranium, you could release the same energy as 2.5 tons of coal would produce. So a very, very significant amount of energy could be produced from a very small amount of material. And things began to change. For the first time now, as soon as people began to work out just how important it was, this huge release of energy from a very small amount of material, suddenly there became a military consequence for this. And people began to think, if we can create a very powerful explosive from a very small amount of material, how might we turn that into something that could be used for war? And what changed everything in many ways, and what changed the program certainly from a United States perspective, was a letter that was written in August the 2nd, 1939, so just before the war broke out effectively, where two scientists, Albert Einstein, who you know, of course, and another one, Leo Szilard, wrote to the President of the United States. And on the second page of their letter, they said this: "I understand Germany has actually stopped the sale of uranium, that she should take an action, should we understand on the grounds of what's going on." And basically what they were saying to President Roosevelt at this time, just at the point in which war was breaking out, was that the German scientists knew all about this technology, that there was evidence that they were beginning to move in this direction, and therefore the Americans needed to watch out for Germany producing a bomb based on this scientific information. But that was very much based on guesswork. People didn't know what the Germans were up to at this stage. The Americans, of course, wouldn't join the war for another couple of years. What was happening in Germany, but no one knew at the time, but with hindsight we now know, is that the Germans were actually beginning to start their own atomic program very, very early on, even before war had begun. So you can see some of the information here, just some quotes from some of the leading German scientists, what they were doing. We now know that in September 1939, what became known in English as the Uranium Club, all of the key scientists working under Werner Heisenberg, who you'll recall was involved in this very early on, began to look at the German, at the atomic bomb program. And the result of that was in February 1940, a few months later, when Heisenberg, now back in Germany, now living under the Nazi regime, a Nazi regime at war in Europe, submitted a 2-page document where he said, and this is a quote, "You can use the uranium fission for the production of energy, powerful explosions, explosives that outmatch all up to now known explosives at least 10 times the power." So you can get a sense of just how significant this was for the war effort that was going on. And for the Allies, it became crucial to know how far were the Germans going to get ahead with this. What intelligence was there to suggest what was going on? And here is where we begin to meet some of these heroic individuals who were providing information back to Britain, whose names don't necessarily get talked about in the same way. And the first individual was this man, whose code name became known as the Griffin, Paul Roseboard. He was an Austrian. Here's a bit of biographical information about him. He was married to a Jewish lady. He had taken his doctorate. He'd worked in Berlin. And because he was an editor for the then biggest scientific journal in Europe, he got to know many of the leading German scientists, and he knew all of them very, very well. And he published in his magazine that story that broke out at the end of 1938, which you remember was sent to just 1 or 2 people at the time. And he began to work with lots of these German scientists, trying to find out what was known. Back in London, in March 1940, 2 scientists wrote to the British Prime Minister in much the same way that Einstein had written to Roosevelt, warning the leaders just how dangerous this material could be if it was discovered, just how successful it could be for a war effort, and raising the risk that the Germans might be working on this, and so other people needed to work on this first. In Britain, that took a number of months, and the response in Britain, if you never know how to do something, the response is always to set up a committee. A committee solves all problems, and so in Britain they set something up called the Maud Committee, which for many decades afterwards people tried to work out who was this mysterious Maud, and it turned out it had been Niels Bohr's nanny when he was a young child, which was much less interesting. But this committee was founded in March 1940 in response to that memorandum that had gone to the British Prime Minister, looking at could you actually build a bomb? How feasible was it? And 4 different universities in the UK were asked to look at this, to think about could you turn the science which existed on bits of paper into something which could eventually become a bomb. And it was prompted by a concern about what the Germans might be doing, and it took a very long time to report. As it says here, it took 15 months to report, finally concluding in June 1941 that a bomb was feasible. And it warned, and it's got it on the bottom there, we know that Germany has taken a great deal of trouble to secure supplies of the substance known as heavy water. And heavy water was something which was very misunderstood, or not at all well understood, in the UK. But there was some information about it. It was known in Germany at that time that the best moderator, so that one of the means of creating fissionable material, was heavy water. And it was known that the only factory producing heavy water was right here where we're sitting today. In November 1939, the Germans had asked if they could produce more heavy water for them. This was, of course, before the invasion and occupation. They asked if they could increase the rate from 10 kilograms a month to 100 kilograms a month, which at the time was a very sizable increase. As we now know, even at that stage in early 1940, there were a number of significant people very, very worried about what the Germans might do with heavy water, not having any sense of its military role. But this strange thing about why would the Germans want so much heavy water? There's something that feels a bit strange about it. The heavy water itself that existed at this factory at that time, as you can see here, was secretly removed to Paris. And just before Paris itself was invaded by the Germans in 1940, those stocks were removed to the UK, finally moving to Windsor Castle. And I don't know how long it stayed there, and whether the royal family knew at the time that it was in Windsor Castle, but that's where it ended up. So where does British intelligence come into all of this? There were concerns about what the Germans might be doing, of course. There were concerns about what the Germans were doing in a very wide array of subjects. And British intelligence worked across a whole variety of subjects trying to find out what was going on. But one of the key figures in trying to bring all of this together, in a sense, was this individual, a sort of hero figure of mine who died in the mid-1950s. His death certificate lists alcoholism as his cause of death, which may or may not be the only MI6 officer that ever said that. And he had a very sort of checkered past. He'd grown up on the northeast coast of England near Newcastle. He had had a very uneventful World War I military career and had then left in 1919 for Bergen and spent 20 years living on the Norwegian coast in Bergen, learning Norwegian. As far as anyone knows, having no family links to the country or the town before that, just moved to Bergen. Married a Norwegian lady who lived there, had 3 children, and lived here for 20 years. And he worked for a company that was creating maritime paint, and his great claim to fame was inventing the waterproof paints that was in sardine tins at the time. So you could eat your sardines without dying from paint intoxication. And as part of that, in the mid-1930s, while developing this very sophisticated paint that was waterproof, he came here to Rjukan and he advised them on how they could paint the floors so that the paint would not get ruined if water splashed on the floors. When war broke out in 1940, long story short, he volunteered for war service in the UK. He joined naval intelligence and very quickly was recruited by MI6, or SIS as its proper name is known. And he rapidly became head of the Norwegian section, not least because he knew the country and knew the language. And it's very clear from lots of his work, lots of the private papers that he was involved with, he had a very deep love for Norway. He was very concerned about some of the subsequent attacks that took place for fear that the Norwegian locals in the towns would have some kind of response put down upon them afterwards. Together with him, the other key individual, so he was responsible during the war for MI6 operations in Norway. His counterpart on the sort of operational side, if you like, was Colonel John Wilson. John Wilson was responsible for special operations. Eric Welsh was responsible for special intelligence. And working together, they ensured that across different parts of Norway, there were very, very good systems and networks created. So just to give you a sense of this, MI6, SIS, set up from September 1940 onwards a series of wireless communication stations, as you can see, dotted all around, mostly along the coastline of Norway, really designed to look out for German ships. And their great claim to fame was the sinking of the Tirpitz cruiser. But as part of this, they also worked very closely passing across other bits of intelligence. One book suggests that there were 1,800 Norwegians secretly working for the resistance, secretly working with MI6 to pass intelligence from all of these different regions back to London, where the Norwegian government was at the time. And in May 1941, one station, Skylark B, received this message. And the fact that the very last line was in Norwegian, people have assumed ever since means that it was written by Eric Welsh, because he was the only person in London speaking Norwegian from SIS writing back. So from these series of stations, as you can see, there was nothing nearby here at the time. That would come later. A series of individuals began to pass information through these wireless stations from various places in Norway, but particularly around here, back to London. Perhaps the most important was this individual, and I'm going to completely mangle Norwegian names now, Leif Tronstad. Close enough. Who many of you will know. He had been a professor in Trondheim, and October 1940, we know that he volunteered information to British intelligence. And we know that a month later, he visited this chap, much older then in the photograph, Yoma Brun, who was the chief engineer here in Rjukan at the factory. They'd been classmates originally, and Tronstad, who was involved with British intelligence by that time, simply asked the question of Brun, why are the Germans so interested in heavy water? What do they want it for? They had no idea why the Germans would want to know what that was for. And they agreed very simply that the German interest was a bit odd. Didn't know what it was for, it just didn't seem right. And so they agreed that it should be monitored. In March 1940, I haven't got a photograph here, but another Norwegian, Alf Loken, approached Tronstad with the requirement that he was already in touch with SIS. SIS wanted to know everything about Norsk Hydro and what was going on. And so through a series of individuals, just these three individuals from the start, began to pass intelligence back to the UK. And just to give you a sense of just how hard that was, the bottom bullet point, this original piece of information was smuggled on a very thin piece of cigarette paper from Rjukan to the coast, by boat to Scotland, and then from Scotland down to London. And that little piece of very thin cigarette paper suggested to British intelligence that the Germans were very, very interested in what was going on. In October 41, Tronstad escaped to England. He was debriefed by Eric Welsh. Welsh wrote afterwards, and it's got the quote there, "The removal of this source of supply, i.e. heavy water, would completely cripple any designs the Germans may have to this type of weapon." And Welsh already knew Brun, of course. They had met each other in the mid-1930s back here when he had advised him. And so there was one pocket of Norwegian resistance here, passing that intelligence on heavy water supplies, on what the Germans were doing, back to London. Totally separate to that was other sources of intelligence reaching British intelligence about what the Germans were doing. So via Paul Roseboard, the Austrian scientist I said earlier, he managed to get lots and lots of information from the leading German scientists. And via a Norwegian called Sverre Berg, who wrote this book up at the top, who acted as the intermediary between Roseboard in Austria and Germany and British intelligence in London, he passed across information about what the Germans were doing. Now, the key thing here, of course, is like any intelligence operation, you need to make sure that people can't find out too much, and therefore, if one gets caught, it sacrifices what someone else was doing. So Roseboard and Berg knew what the German scientists were doing. They didn't know what was going on here. And the Norwegian resistance officers here passing intelligence to the UK knew all about the heavy water, but knew nothing about the nuclear progress being made in Germany. It was only in London, really, in a small number of people in British intelligence, where this information was being put together. And what it revealed was some of this. Really, it was only known from the end of 1941, the start of 1942, just how serious the Germans were taking this. It was only known at that point that the Germans were really trying to work very hard to build this bomb. And at that point, further efforts were made to try and gather more and more intelligence, because not huge amounts was known. What did all of this tell us in terms of what actually was known? Well, it was known for instance, from one report, German scientists, the building of unusual constructions, the production of unusual materials, suggested that something much more significant was going on. But the fact is, and I've highlighted a few bits here, I'll read them just in case you can't see them. The fact is that no important intelligence had been obtained by May 1942. From the occasional summaries that remain in SIS files, it's safe to conclude that SIS and SOE had by that date succeeded only in confirming in general terms that the Germans remained active in trying to build a program. It was only in 23rd of April 1942, lacking any firm intelligence about the German program, recommended that something should be done to stop the production of heavy water in Norway. And by 7th of May 1942, this began to be studied by SOE in terms of how could you actually do something about it. The question, of course, is why did they then think that something should be done without any very good intelligence about what the Germans were doing, without any very good intelligence about how far they had progressed? Why did they decide that something should be done? Very early on, various plans had been made to work out how you could stop the water production being made here, heavy water. One of the scientists had tried to poison it slightly, and the water began to froth, which gave off a sign that something strange was going on, and he was stopped. Another scientist suggested that up in the dam Mostvatten, which is also very badly pronounced, that you could perhaps put a mine into the dam, let the mine go through the tunnels, through the mountains, until it reached the pipes at the top here and explode something that way. And that was also thought to be a very bad idea for various reasons. So the question then is why from the summer of 42, not only was there an idea that something should be done to stop the heavy water here, but there was a real sense of urgency. Part of the reason is that there were local from here who, of course, is remembered very famously, Anna Hereid, in the spring of 1942 arrived in England, and he revealed far more about just how quickly heavy water was being produced here and how the Germans wanted to increase production more and more and more and more. By May 1942, Welsh had asked Tronstadt, who was still in London, to try and create an intelligence network around this part of Norway, around Vemork, to get out much more intelligence about what was going on. And the result of that was in June 42, and I quote, "The first positive warning was received that Germany was working on a bomb." And it was known that the heavy water was being transported from here by train to the lake, across the lake by ferry, but it was not known where the barrels were going from there. So that was another information that was sought. But all of this brought together in the summer of 1942 led to a simple fact. It's our belief that the information which has been obtained can only justify the conclusion that German work, TA was the British codename tube alloys for the atomic bomb, has not yet reached a stage where the construction of large plants has started. There is no likelihood of the use by the Germans of an atomic bomb, effectively, for many months at least. So why was the decision therefore made to try and attack the plant? The decision was made, and it was made originally in 18th of November 1942, to attack the plant by 2 aircraft towing British Royal Engineers by glider, which of course then crashed. The decision was that something had to be done. That you could not take the risk at that point in 1942, with the war going the way it was going, which was very bad for the Allies, even if you didn't know how far the Germans had progressed, even if you didn't think that the Germans would get a bomb in the coming weeks or months, the fact was if you could do something to try and stop their efforts, that opportunity had to be taken. And when this operation failed disastrously, when these gliders crashed, and when all of the individuals either died on landing, or the ones that were still alive were caught by the Germans and tortured and interrogated and eventually executed, it was thought that even after that had gone so badly wrong, something had to be done. Just the last couple of slides now. What this suggested was actually a parachute-borne operation by locals who knew the area, could blend in with the local Norwegians, was the only way that you could go about it. But it was known that because of the glider operation, where the Germans had found a map for the factory, where the British officers that had survived while they were being interrogated had revealed that their aim was to come to this factory and to blow it up, the Germans knew that this was the target. And as a result of that, the local Norwegians in the region passed intelligence back to London that there were additional soldiers, that the Nazi commander in Germany had visited, and that the area above the factory where the pipes come down the hill were all mined, and there were mines elsewhere. And so the response of all of this, and SIS was informed about these changes a week after they took place. That's how quickly information could leave this region and arrive back in London. It was known the Germans were on high alert and what was going on. On the 15th of December, the SIS Skylark station Corona said, if you're going to drop agents in northern parts of Telemark, be very careful. The Germans know about this place. And the result, of course, was the very successful operation, which we know and have studied here. The operation where the saboteurs came in. The photograph on the bottom left, for instance, is a photograph that had been supplied by someone here in the factory in the early 1940s that had been sent across to British intelligence. And so even when they were planning, once they'd been parachuted in and were living in the region and planning the attack, they were still receiving up-to-date intelligence about where the Germans were, how many Germans were going to be on alert here, and that they should not, for instance, cross the bridge because there was a machine gun turret focusing on it. So really that hopefully that has given you a sense of the intelligence that led up to the operation that we celebrate here today. And as I said at the start, it's an operation which, you know, the heroism and the bravery absolutely should be applauded and remembered for all of it was. But I think sometimes we tend to overshadow some of the other individuals that passed across, you know, just as accurate intelligence which allowed them to do what they did in the way that they did, and really gave people back in London, British intelligence and the Norwegian government, a strong sense of just how important it was to attack this plant. And on that point, everyone still seems to be awake. I shall stop. I know. Thank you.
Did I understand you correctly now that you're basically saying that if we look at the actual knowledge, the actual intelligence, it's sort of hard to explain the efforts based on actual knowledge on the German nuclear program?
I think there are two elements. One is there was very good information about what was going on here in the factory, in terms of the rate of production, in terms of how much heavy water the Germans wanted, how they wanted the rate to be increased and increased and increased, but without any sense here. And what's interesting is these saboteurs didn't know why they were attacking the factory. They just knew that the heavy water had to be destroyed, but didn't know why. So on the one hand, the intelligence here was very, very good. The intelligence about how far the Germans had got was less good, but convinced people in London that they had not got very far. And it's a very interesting intelligence challenge. It's one thing to prove something exists. It's much harder to prove that something does not exist. So it was very hard to suggest the Germans haven't got very far, why not? And that surprised people because Heisenberg was one of the most famous scientists of the day. But the reality was the risk was too great. If you knew, and the people in London knew, that the heavy water could be used, and its only use in that level of quantity was for an atomic bomb, you couldn't take the risk, and that's the reality.
And yeah, because the reason I'm asking the question is, like, every summer, obviously we have a lot of visitors here every summer. Based on that, we also have a lot of campaigns, marketing campaigns, as easy as that. And every summer the same thing happens. We see a lot of engagement going on in discussions when we tell people that you can come to Wemork and visit this place, and you always see like a heated discussion actually on the importance of these operations, and I guess, is this something that is a general issue? I mean, being head of war studies, I take it that you've studied more than just this topic. Lots of wars, and also looking at the SOE, the sabotage as a strategy during World War II. Looking at it with the glasses of 2024. The strategy that was chosen by the SOE and the allies in terms of intelligence, how would you perceive and rate that?
I mean, people write books about this every year. There's a new one that came out in English a few months ago that says nothing new, but still says it's the operation that changed the war.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but I don't think it did. I mean, I think if you look at this with the total benefit of hindsight, you can see that the Germans would never have got the atomic bomb in World War II, whether this operation went on or not. On the other hand, it achieved various things. For SOE, it showed that you could plan a sabotage operation in an occupied country and it could succeed. And for SOE, it was the first very successful operation that took place. I think for the Norwegians itself, it gave them this great sort of way of rising up against the Germans and showing that actually the Germans could be attacked and beaten. And it wasn't the first sabotage operation in Norway, of course. There were others, but the scale of it, I think, and the sort of daring of it were remarkable. The German atomic bomb, I mean, people have written about this, and it splits opinions. There are two schools of thought, really. One says, why didn't the Germans get the bomb? And the first school of thought says, because the German scientists simply didn't know how to make it. It wasn't that they didn't want Hitler to have the bomb, they just couldn't work out the physics of making a bomb. And that argument is based on, at the end of the war, the German scientists were all captured. They were put in a very big country house in Cambridgeshire in England. Every room was wired for sound. And when the American atomic bombs were dropped on Japan, the German scientists said, how have they done it? And they had a scientific conversation trying to work it out. And it was very clear they had no idea. The other school of thought says that Werner Heisenberg was, the best scientist of the day. Had he wanted to work on it, he could have worked on it. And he just was a not very good Nazi and chose that he did not want the Germans to have the bomb.
Oh, you sort of ruined my next question, because I was I was sorry. No, I was just going to ask about that, because if you look at the German military part, if you look at the officers, we have lots of stories about German officers, I mean, sabotaging from within. Yeah. And so, since you've already now revealed your take on that, you feel that was this only Heisenberg? Like, if he really had wanted to develop this in a military sense, he would have succeeded. Well, he would have. Yeah.
There's a very famous meeting between Heisenberg and Bohr, fairly early on in the war, in Copenhagen, where both of them afterwards remembered something different from the meeting. Bohr thought that Heisenberg was coming to him saying, come and work for the German atomic bomb program. Heisenberg afterwards said that he was trying to warn the world via Bohr about what the Germans were doing. But both sort of had different views about all of this. How far the Germans would have got is unknown. The point of this, I think, is that by 1943, British intelligence knew, and we know that it was correct, now, that the Germans were not going to get the atomic bomb. They were working too slowly. They weren't putting the effort into it. The effort was going into rockets and other things. But the great fear in the last 2 years of the war was that the Germans would use what they were doing with heavy water to create radioactive materials, what we would now call a dirty bomb. So you'd have a conventional explosive that would somehow use some of these radioactive materials and poison the area, if you like. And so actually, even though in a sense, this didn't stop the German atomic bomb program. It stopped them having that raw material that could be used for a dirty bomb. So I think it didn't change the war, but it did solve a lot of problems, I think. And I now don't remember what question you actually asked me.
Well, you answered it anyway, so that's good. No, I was thinking about, like, do you think there was a conscious effort from the scientists in Germany, just like the officers in German?
Yeah. So some of that, I mean, hindsight is wonderful, of course. It was clear that as we know from the wartime American effort, which cost at the time billions of dollars, involved, I forget how many, but tens of thousands of people. To have built an atomic bomb in the 1940s involved an enormous effort, and the Germans never put enough money, effort, people into it to have actually ever achieved anything. And part of the argument is that because they didn't understand what was required. Is that because the scientists knew what was required but didn't want the Germans to get the Nazis to get the bomb? It's very unclear, and I don't know that we'll ever know, to be honest.
By the way, I forgot to mention, any other questions in the audience? Please feel free to jump in, and whether it's in Norwegian or English. Yes?
Mr. Tronstad was an offer of an attack and he was shot. Could Wilson have stopped him from going to Norway?
Oh gosh, I don't know as much about that attack. Probably.
Wilson was his superior.
Yeah, I think my sense is that he felt like he was missing out because there were so many other Norwegians coming back and taking part in Norway itself. He wanted to.
But I think Tronstad wanted to do some active service.
Yeah.
So therefore he wanted to go to Norway.
Yeah.
Another question, why did Norway start producing heavy water in 1934?
In the first place? In 34.
Yeah.
I think it wasn't it originally, it was a byproduct of something else, and it was being used for fertilizer, I think. I'm being attacked by the chair.
No, I'm getting a little nervous, so my colleagues here, which are guides, know a little bit more, so just correct me if I'm wrong.
Because they could.
Yeah. I think also when as a byproduct there was some interesting research, I believe, for medical purposes, which turned out to have unfortunate side effects that people did not survive. And I think they researched several potential uses, but I see this gentleman has
the answer.
Yeah.
Question. We call it heavy water, but it's the term is deuterium oxide. That was discovered 2 years before by an American scientist called Urey in 1932, and immediately that was a discovery on the level of Chadwick's neutron. And it was part of the development of in nuclear science, because they needed light isotopes to bombard heavy isotopes. But in Norway, they started in 1934 to use in this hydrogen factory. You enriched heavy water in these cells to about 10%. So they wanted to enhance or enrich the content to 90%, 99%. To use this new invention for scientific and medical purposes. So this was used in the laboratories, very small quantities. That's the reason. Hydro was looking for more legs to stand on, so to speak.
Commercial opportunities.
Yeah.
I see there is a question, and you yeah.
The American bombs, the first one they tested was uranium, and Little was plutonium, and Fatman was uranium.
I think the other way around.
Other way around.
Other way around.
It's the other way around.
Yeah.
Why did they choose plutonium instead of uranium when Germany focused on uranium? You know that?
The Americans, they had different. The way they were organized in Los Alamos in New Mexico, they had different teams working on different elements of it, or different approaches rather. And the first test was of a plutonium bomb, which scientifically worked very differently to a uranium gun method bomb. And they had to test that one in the desert. They were confident that the uranium method would work, and so they tried that for the first time over Hiroshima, and of course it did work. They were different methods of doing it, I think, and one turned out to be more effective than the other scientifically, but they were just different methods. Heavy water would have worked as a moderator. It was just much less effective than the way that the Americans managed it with graphite and other things.
Because they also tested a lot of bombs during the 60s in Marshall Islands.
Yeah, 40s, 50s, 60s, all the way through. And from the early 60s, they then moved underground. And since 63, I think they've all been underground. And now they can basically do them on computers. You can model whether they'll work on a computer. You don't physically have to test it. And of course, the biggest one was the Russian Tsar bomb in 61.
Yeah, it blew out windows in Norway as well.
Yeah, I mean, compared to Hiroshima's 15 kilotons, that one was 61 megatons. I can't work out quickly enough what the difference was, but much bigger. And actually, the science of a thermonuclear hydrogen bomb is unlimited. You could, and the Russians decided to limit it to 61 megatons because the plane dropping it couldn't have got away far enough had it been any bigger.
Yeah, because I heard a story about one of the pilots at that last plane.
Yeah.
He wrote that they felt the vibration in the plane.
I'm sure, yeah. And they were a long, long away.
Northern Norway, that they blew up windows at schools and offices.
Well, that was, I mean, if you fast forward this story to the sort of post-war period, from the first Soviet test was in August 49, and for about 5 years or so, they tested them in Kazakhstan, in a place called Semipalatinsk, and then they moved to Novaya Zemlya. And in the 1950s, when British intelligence and American intelligence were saying, where is the friendliest country to monitor those tests? The answer was Norway, of course. And so actually, you know, although the story was very different, huge efforts went on in northern Norway to monitor those tests.
The next time you come here, I think it would be really interesting. You know, you met already Professor Arnulf, which has done a lot of research on the Norwegian take and the Norwegian strategy in terms of nuclear science and nuclear programs, and also going back to the Hydro position in for political purposes and for industrial strategic purposes in Norway. I think there's still a lot to research to look at what was going on. I mean, you've touched some of it, and then you see what's going on industrially, even going back to the World War I. How Mr. Sam Eide, how we navigated the fact that a lot of the products that came out of Rjukan and Notodden are fairly essential to production of weapons of several kinds. Yeah. But I think you had a question. Yeah.
Interesting lecture.
Thank you.
Could you turn back to this focal point of July 1942? And I missed your points about why. Why the intelligence concluded that that there had to be something had to be done.
Yeah.
It was. I mean, I skipped over it very quickly. I think that first bullet point says a lot. If you bring together what was known about the what heavy water would have been for, and the scientists in London would have known heavy water can be used as a moderator for an atomic bomb. That's really the only reason why the Germans would want it in those quantities. So that's point one. What was known from the German scientists, via the people I said already, but a few other things, there were other things. So it was known that the Germans were trying to get uranium from the Belgian mines. It was known that in Paris, which of course had been overrun by the Germans, Marie Curie's cyclotron, which again has distinct reasons why you'd want it for an atomic bomb. The Germans were very keen on that. And if you brought all of that together, while it didn't necessarily tell you how far the Germans had got, it told you without a shadow of a doubt they were interested in this and they were working on this. And therefore, the risk was, well, what do we do? Do we wait until we know more? Or do we take an opportunity to try and stop their efforts in any way we can? And nothing could be done to attack the German scientists. It was very hard to get intelligence out of Germany itself. So not that this was an easier target, but this was a perfect sabotage operation that could stop some of their efforts. That's why. So even if you didn't know how useful it would be, if you could try and stop it somehow, you had to take that opportunity. And that was being urged by people like Tronstadt in London, Jomelbrunn, who was the chief engineer here, who provided that photograph I showed you in the corner, blueprints of the whole factory. He'd come over, he basically had been evacuated, if you like, from Norway with his wife and had moved to London in 1942 around the same kind of time and was talking about it. So just the risk was too high. October. Thank you.
Yeah, one more and then Ulio. Yeah. No, please.
You mentioned Rosberg, very interesting.
Yeah.
And in my view, there is a let's say historical irony, because the first intelligence report given by Rosberg, that was in June 1942, and he refers to the famous Hartmark House meeting in I think it was the 6th of June or something, when the German scientists disappoint the military authorities, and the military says, okay, we will downgrade the whole project. And there was also this famous quote by Heisenberg saying that if we can make a bomb, then it would be as small as a pineapple. And the content of that meeting was reported to SIS. And that is just 1 month before this focus, that's July decision. Something has to be done. Have you have you reflected on this irony?
Not specifically. I would say this is the start of what will hopefully be a much bigger project. And Roseboard, I think, is... So I think there's a fair bit known about... If you look at the bigger picture of intelligence on the German atomic bomb, some bits are very well known. You know, the sabotage operation here is well known. The end of it in 1945 as the Allied armies liberated Europe, the Alsos mission to capture the scientists where they found the cave in Germany is very well known. The bits in between are very, very poorly researched, actually. And someone like Roseboard, there's a book by him by a now dead American scientist called Arnold Kramish. And I met Kramish a few times in America 20 years ago when I was doing PhD research. And I read that book and I remember saying to him, you know, the footnotes are not very extensive, where's all your material? And we had lots of discussions, and the book was discounted by a lot of people as being probably a bit made up, because there were conversations between people and you couldn't work out where he got the sources. And actually that had been my view, and I've been changing my mind about that over the last few months as I've started researching this. because what I've discovered is that all of the individuals that were involved, Roseboard and every single individual you can think of that I've discussed, Kramish wrote to them and tried to get information from them. And actually, the level of diligence in his research is amazing, I think. So I've totally changed my mind. So I can't, hand on heart say every word in his book is totally accurate. But actually, he was a very, very sort of serious researcher in what he did. So that meeting that you've mentioned, I've not looked at it in detail, but I will come to it. But if Roseboard was involved with it, then almost certainly it would have made its way to London via Sveberg. Yeah. He was the courier. Not the only one, actually. And part of this, I think there's a number of other Norwegians that I don't yet know the identity of, and maybe we will never know them. Some in this factory who were passing intelligence after Brunn escaped to London. Even when the saboteurs were here in the region, were still getting intelligence about where the Germans were, how many there were, how many were on night duty, and even in the days before the attack were getting information. Who it was coming from, I don't know. But Roseboard was also getting his information out via someone else, via the legation in Sweden, particularly. So
that's I think that will be very valuable. I mean, and just to hear you say that there is so much to delve into, and I think also for our area actually, and this museum, and for everybody studying this, it's going to be very interesting to see how research will enlighten or uncover more levels. Ole, I know you've been waiting to ask a question.
Yeah, I'm interested in the timeline as well, and going back to the war starting, and they're moving the heavy water from Paris to England, because that's way earlier than the committee had decided that this was important. I want your opinion on that, and also that we know Hitler was a dictator. He decided a lot what was going on, and how he treated this, and how important he thought the bomb was. And also, if the war had gone on longer, what are the speculations about that? So it's a three-part question.
Gosh, I'm going to forget them all. So on the first one about the heavy water, I mean, I sort of went over this quickly just because of time. There's more detail here, and it's a reasonably well-known story, but actually it was French intelligence that got the early stocks out. And so this guy, where is he? This banker, Jacques Allier, was working for the French intelligence service, the Deuxième Bureau at the time. He was asked to come here. He visited here in March 1940. By coincidence, met Yoma Brunn again, and they got the stocks out. They got them to Paris because at that time they were worried about what the Germans were going to do. And then in March 1940, when they got them, they were very concerned, correctly, that France would be overrun very quickly. So they got them across the Channel to England. But it was quite forward thinking, really, to get them out. And that's because, as it says here, earlier on, it was known that the Germans, even before April 1940, wanted the rate of production here to increase, and no one knew why. And it was that risk. I've already forgotten your second question.
Well, and in addition to that, they moved it to England, but they couldn't be sure that the Germans could be, or maybe the Germans or the British were sure that the Germans would invade Britain. But still, I think they could have moved it further on if it was that important from Britain. Was there discussions about that?
I've not looked into it, to be honest. I don't know, and I don't know. After it went to Windsor Castle, I'm not quite sure where it went after that, to be brutally honest. I know some of it was used by scientists in Britain. I don't know enough about where the rest of it went.
There was
no discussion.
That was early on.
That was early on. Yeah.
According to the decision, that this was very important.
Yeah, early on, when I don't think anyone quite knew what it would be for. and certainly before the experiments had shown that it wasn't the best way to moderate, to create the fissionable material. What were your other questions?
Well, it was like if the war had gone on.
Oh, if the war had gone on. So what were, the Germans moved their pile, as it's called, to this town called Hechingen in somewhere in Germany, and that's where the Allies, Erich Welsch, who I showed a photograph, that's where he discovered it during the end of the war. It was clear that it was a working pile, but if you compare what the Germans were doing to the scale of the Manhattan Project, you couldn't compare them. They were so far away from actually creating a bomb. And it comes back to your question earlier. Did the scientists want to make it? Did they understand it? It's clear that Albert Speer, who was in charge of the armaments program in Germany, sort of saw rockets and better aircraft as a much better weapon for the war to concentrate on. So I don't think the Germans ever really took it seriously. Now, whether that came from the scientists, whether it came from the sort of politicians, if you like, I don't know. But neither one ever really took it seriously enough. And so the risk, as I mentioned, was this sort of radioactive dirty device rather than the bomb itself. The sort of one caveat to all of that is it was known that Heisenberg was in charge of the Uranium Club, which was the A team of scientists, the best ones. There was a B team led by a guy called Kurt Diebner, who was a really horrible pro-Nazi scientist. And there was a book that came out 15 years ago or so, only in German, called Hitler's Bomb, which says that Diebner, his B team, created and exploded a dirty bomb somewhere in the German forest somewhere. And so argues that they did create a bomb, but it wasn't really a bomb as anyone else would understand it.
In accordance with the Diebner thing and this particular questions, often when you see people write about it or discuss it, the subject of Russian archives comes up. Just on a general note, do you think there are anything interesting to be found
on this period? Possibly not. I mean, there's a very good book about the Soviet atomic bomb that was written 30 years ago, and it shows that the Russian scientists first got wind of the fact that the Americans were making an atomic bomb because all of the leading American scientists stopped publishing anything. So it was sort of, that a lack of presence suggested they must be doing government work, and everything they were doing had become secret, which turned out to be correct. That's what prompted the Russian program to start. They didn't start it properly until the end of the war, after the American bombs were dropped on Japan.
And you don't think they found anything in Germany during their
after the D-Day landings? From the west, British, American, Canadian forces were rushing towards Berlin. The Russian forces were rushing towards Berlin from the other perspective. It was this race to get there first. And behind both armies were teams of intelligence officers collecting whatever information they could. So there are photographs of the German pile in this town in Germany, and the British and American intelligence officers digging up in the grounds these block cubes of I forget what, but some material. And it was known that the Russians had got there and got some of them, but not all of them. And the big race was for the scientists themselves. And so the Americans got lots of scientists from their zone. The leading leading German scientists that had built the V1 and the V2 missiles then became Americans working on the space program, of course. The Russians got some of the German scientists, the sort of less good ones, but they also took some of the Japanese biological weapons research, which was going on over in the Far East, of course. But the Japanese did some utterly horrible things on humans with biological weapons, and the Russians and the Americans got a lot of that information.
So a race for scientists more than documentation then?
The scientists themselves, absolutely. Yeah, very much so.
If I may, I would like a question connected with another paradox. I think you mentioned that by 1943 the British intelligence concluded that there was no danger anymore.
Yeah.
And there was some discussion about these dirty bombs. Especially the Americans were very interested in that. But in my view, it is a paradox when the British intelligence says by August 43 there is no real danger of a German nuclear gadget. And the British also downplays the danger of the dirty bomb. So why then the sinking of the ferry in February 44 if there was no danger?
I think the simple answer is, you again, much like the attack here, you can't take that risk. If you can sabotage the operation somehow, you have to be able to do it. I think the ferry one is arguably more of a contentious decision, because there was no way that the ferry could be sunk, I think, without loss of life, which was different to here. I mean, here the risk was not people being killed in the attack; it was the reprisals. That was the concern. The ferry, and the Norwegians that placed those explosives were themselves very worried about it, of course. That one I don't know. I would need to look into that more, because I don't know how much of that came from London and how much of that was decided here, sort of locally, if you like. Where for the other attacks, the impetus very much came from London, often against what the local Norwegians in London wanted to do. So, after the attack here, the third attack with the US Air Force bombing it, the Norwegians in London were very, very angry with the Brits who knew about it, because they had not been asked or consulted or even told beforehand. So I think actually, if you look at, the 4 operations, some successful, some not, and the level of engagement, discussion with, approval sought from the Norwegians in London, it probably varied across all 4 of them, actually.
I see some very patient children in the midst of this room. I'm very impressed, I have to say, at this time of day. So 2 questions. One sort of hopefully to the point. Maybe I might sound a little paranoid with what I'm going to ask you now, but because I'm kind of and there is one question that's totally on the side, but you just have to bear with me. Eric Welsh. Yeah. For me, it's like a fascinating character in this, and I'm thinking. So there's this British chemists who ends up in Bergen, and he just happens to visit Vemork just before the war breaks out, and then he just happens to end up in charge of the intelligence service, just because he happens to speak Norwegian. Is that likely? I just have to. Maybe it's a stupid question, but I'm like.
I mean, it'd be a great badge of honor to say that we were that forward thinking, that we would put someone there for 20 years.
Yeah, well, I've seen too many spy movies. Perhaps I'm just like, is there? It's just that he just was very skilled, paint knowledgeable.
Welsh died in the mid-1950s, clearly before I was born, so I was never able to meet him.
Yeah, you couldn't interview him.
I couldn't interview him. But I did, after some effort, find his son, who has now died but lived on the south coast of England. And I spent probably 10 years hounding him with letters to try and get him to respond. And he eventually did respond. And I remember going down to visit him, and he had a photograph album of the sort of the interwar period in Bergen, and he alleged that his dad had been sent here by British intelligence all along, exactly the way you said.
I didn't know.
But I have never ever seen any evidence to prove that.
Then I won't investigate that question any further.
And it would also go against how British intelligence normally does things. The Russians and Chinese play the long game in ways that British and American intelligence never has.
Yeah. That is sort of a good introduction to my last question. That is totally on the side, because I'm starting to get more and more fascinated with Churchill's fascination when it comes to Norway.
Mhm.
So what's your take on his alleged obsession with this country?
I don't know enough about it to give you a proper answer.
Shoot. Okay.
But I think most Brits that come to Norway fall in love with the country. And I will stop there.
Yeah, that's the marketing part for tonight. Any other questions before I sort of want to make sure that your kids want to come back? Just one question, yeah.
The king, Håkon, asked Tronstad, when will the bomb be ready? And he said, in a year.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
How could he be so... that was a guess.
I don't think... I mean, it's the interesting thing about... not this, but this whole story. There were two secrets in World War II that were more secret than anything else. One was the breaking of the German codes, the Enigma codes. The other was the atomic bomb, its existence, the science. So Tronstad... and so in this, the great challenge was you could have people passing intelligence, which was very secret, but they would not be told about the bomb. And you would have people that would know about the bomb that would not be told about the intelligence. And so the number of people that really understood both was very, very, very small. And although Tronstad would have been very involved, there would have been a lot of intelligence he would not have been shown. So my guess is that would have been a guess rather than anything else.
But one last question, according to that. The level of trust between the Norwegians and the British is quite amazing, I think.
Absolutely.
And it's not compared to anything else when you see like France or whatever, or America. What do you think about that? Did that make any change in this situation?
I think that's absolutely the case. And if you look at what Tronstad, as an example, had access to in terms of the people who would have been very secret, in terms of the intelligence, which would have been very secret, there were no other countries, I don't think, that had, probably apart from the Americans, and even then they weren't shown stuff until the end of the war. I think Norway was different, and I can't give you the answer for why, but I think it was, and it comes back to your question in some ways. I think it was, and maybe it was, the level of resistance here, which was very different to other countries that were occupied. Maybe it was the desire to sort of strike back in a way that the French did, but in much smaller ways. The Belgians didn't really, the Dutch didn't really in the same level. Very different, I think.
I'll allow one more question.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a
letter in Germany found in 1970s with Heisenberg's initials, but it was never proved that it was written by him, where he slightly explained that he tried to create a generator instead of a bomb. How likely?
If you look at the main German scientists, almost all of them, as the years from the end of the war got longer and longer and longer, they began to change their tune more and more and more. And as the period got further away, they all said, well, of course we wouldn't have built a bomb, even if we'd have known how. We didn't want the Nazis to win. And so the other big scientist was von Weizsäcker, whose brother was then president of Western Germany, I think, something like that. He very much distanced himself. But there's no evidence, if you look at the wartime period, that they ever really did anything to say no to the Nazi party itself. So I think it's a very interesting one.
Michael, I think you have to come back to I mean, there are so many subjects and lots of things to research. For now, I just wanted to say thank you. There are actually two of these. This is Heroes of Telemark. I thought that would be
thank you.
Two, so maybe your children should get these. And
it's not alcohol.
There is no alcohol in it, I promise. Very healthy Norwegian water. And then since I know you're on a skiing holiday, I take it that you have lots of luggage.